The House Transportation Committee chamber fell into stunned silence as House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confident smile vanishing. Just minutes earlier, he had delivered an eloquent speech about bipartisan cooperation and putting country over party, praising Representative Nancy Mace as a partner in crafting a landmark infrastructure bill. But now, as Mace slowly opened a folder containing legislative drafts and amendment tracking documents, Jeffries' jaw tightened visibly. What she was about to reveal would not only expose how he had secretly inserted last-minute provisions redirecting millions to his own New York district, but would show how he had betrayed the very bipartisan spirit he claimed to champion. The cameras captured every second as one of Congress's most skilled politicians realized his carefully managed image was about to shatter. The morning had begun with promise and optimism. The Infrastructure Investment and Community Development Act, affectionately called the Mace-Jeffries bill by congressional staffers, was being presented to the full Transportation Committee for final review before a floor vote. The legislation represented months of painstaking negotiation between Nancy Mace, a pragmatic Republican from South Carolina, and Hakeem Jeffries, the articulate and ambitious House Democratic leader from New York. In an era defined by partisan gridlock and political warfare, the Mace-Jeffries partnership had become a feel-good story that both parties could celebrate. Here were two politicians from opposite parties, different backgrounds and contrasting ideologies, who had managed to find common ground on critical infrastructure needs. The bill allocated $8.4 billion for roads, bridges, public transportation, and community development projects across the country, using a formula based on population, infrastructure condition, and economic need. Jeffries arrived at the hearing with his characteristic polish. At 54, the Brooklyn native had risen quickly through Democratic ranks, becoming the first black lawmaker to lead a major party in either chamber of Congress. With his eloquent speaking style, sharp legal mind from his years as a corporate litigator, and ability to connect with both progressive and moderate wings of his party, Jeffries was widely seen as a future Speaker of the House. His partnership with Mace was meant to demonstrate his ability to govern, to show that he could deliver results rather than just rhetoric. Nancy Mace sat near the center of the committee dais, her blonde hair pulled back in a professional style, wearing a burgundy blazer that conveyed both authority and approachability. At 47, she had built a reputation as one of the House's most independent-minded Republicans. As the first woman to graduate from the Citadel's Corps of Cadets, she brought a military discipline to her legislative work, thorough, detail-oriented, and unwilling to accept superficial answers or vague commitments. Mace had entered the partnership with Jeffries with cautious optimism. She understood the political risks of working closely with the Democratic leader. Conservative media had already criticized her for being insufficiently partisan, for caring more about getting things done than scoring political points. But Mace believed infrastructure was an area where genuine bipartisan cooperation was both possible and necessary. Her district in South Carolina included Charleston, a growing city with aging infrastructure and desperate need for federal investment. If working with Jeffries could deliver results for her constituents, she was willing to take the political heat. The committee hearing room was packed. C-SPAN cameras were positioned at multiple angles, national media filled the press gallery, and both Democratic and Republican members had shown up in unusually high numbers. The Mace-Jeffries bill had generated significant public interest, covered extensively as a rare example of functional governance. Editorial boards had praised it. Good government groups had endorsed it. Even cynical Washington observers admitted it seemed like genuine bipartisan problem-solving. The hearing began with opening statements from the committee chairman, a Democrat from Oregon, who praised both Mace and Jeffries for their collaborative work. Several other committee members followed with their own commendations, noting how refreshing it was to see politicians putting policy over politics. Then it was Jeffries' turn to speak. He approached the witness table with his characteristic confidence, his navy suit perfectly tailored, his posture conveying the authority of his leadership position. He began with a story about growing up in Brooklyn, walking past crumbling infrastructure on his way to school, understanding from a young age how investment in public goods could transform communities. This legislation, Jeffries said, his voice building with emotion, represents what's possible when we choose collaboration over confrontation, when we prioritize the American people over partisan advantage. I want to particularly thank my partner in this effort, Representative Nancy Mace. We don't agree on everything, we come from different parties, different regions, different perspectives, but we agreed that our constituents deserve better than political theater. They deserve results. The committee room erupted in applause. Several members stood. It was the kind of moment that political professionals dream about. Genuine emotion, bipartisan good feelings, the sense that maybe, just maybe, Washington could still function. Jeffries continued. This bill uses an objective, fair formula to distribute infrastructure funding across the country. No earmarks, no political favoritism, just need-based allocation that ensures every community gets its fair share. That's how government should work. More applause. Jeffries looked toward Mace, expecting her to join in the celebration of their achievement. But Nancy Mace wasn't smiling. Her expression was neutral, almost carefully controlled, as she maintained eye contact with Jeffries. Her hands rested on a manila folder that had been sitting closed in front of her throughout his testimony. Something in her posture made Jeffries pause. He had negotiated with Mace for months, had learned to read her signals. When she was pleased, she was demonstrative. When she was angry, she was direct. But this expression, this careful neutrality was something different, something concerning. The chairman recognized Mace for her opening statement. She adjusted her microphone, took a measured breath, and began speaking in a calm, steady voice that immediately shifted the room's energy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Leader Jeffries, for those kind words about our partnership. Her tone was professional but notably lacking the warmth that had characterized their previous public interactions. I want to start by saying that I entered this process in good faith. I believed that we could work together across party lines to deliver for the American people. I spent 6 months negotiating every provision of this bill, working late nights, making compromises, defending our partnership to skeptical colleagues. She paused, her gaze locked on Jeffries. I believed we had reached an agreement, a real agreement based on mutual trust and shared principles, an agreement that distributed funds fairly, without political manipulation, exactly as Leader Jeffries just described. Several committee members exchanged glances. Mace's tone suggested something was wrong, but it wasn't yet clear what. However, Mace continued, her voice hardening slightly. 3 days ago, my legislative director was reviewing the final bill text that was submitted to the Rules Committee, and she noticed something interesting. Provisions that weren't in our agreed draft. Language that changed the distribution formula in subtle but significant ways. Jeffrey's confident expression began to shift, a slight tightening around his eyes, a stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there moments before. At first, I thought it must be a clerical error, Mace said. Legislative text can be complex. Maybe something got mixed up in the drafting process, so I asked my staff to compare our final agreed draft from April 15th with the version submitted to the Rules Committee on April 18th. And that's when I discovered that this wasn't an error. It was a deliberate change. She opened the manila folder with deliberate slowness, the rustle of papers audible in the now silent chamber. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record 2 versions of the Infrastructure Investment and Community Development Act. Version 1 is the bipartisan agreement that Leader Jeffries and I reached on April 15th. Version 2 is what Leader Jeffries submitted to the Rules Committee without informing me, without discussing the changes, without maintaining the partnership he just eloquently praised. The chairman, sensing the significance of the moment, nodded gravely. Without objection, both versions will be entered into the record. Mace pulled out what appeared to be a detailed comparison document, with sections highlighted in yellow. Let me walk the committee through what changed. In our agreed version, we used a straightforward formula: 50% of funds distributed based on population, 30% based on infrastructure condition assessments, and 20% based on economic need. It was objective, fair, and couldn't be manipulated for political purposes. She flipped to another page. In the version Leader Jeffries submitted without my knowledge, the formula was modified. Now it includes something called urban density adjustment factors and regional economic multipliers. Those sound like technical terms. But what they actually do is redirect a disproportionate amount of funding to specific congressional districts. Jeffries leaned toward his microphone. Representative Mace, those adjustments were technical refinements recommended by committee staff to ensure. I'm not finished, Leader Jeffries, Mace interrupted calmly but firmly. You'll have your opportunity to respond. The sharpness of her interruption was notable. In their months of collaboration, Mace had always been deferential to Jeffries's leadership position, allowing him to speak first, respecting the hierarchy. This public cutting off of the Democratic leader signaled that whatever professional courtesy had existed between them was now gone. These technical refinements, Mace continued, making air quotes with her fingers, would result in a massive shift in how funds are distributed. Let me give you some specific numbers. Under our agreed formula, New York's 8th Congressional District, that's Leader Jeffries' district, would receive approximately $42 million over the 5-year life of this bill. Under the revised formula that he submitted without telling me, that same district would receive $127 million. Gasps rippled through the committee room. Reporters began typing frantically. The math was simple and damning. Jeffries' secret changes would triple the funding going to his own district. But it gets more interesting, Mace said, her tone remaining calm despite the explosive nature of her revelations. My staff analyzed how these formula changes would affect all 435 congressional districts. The top 10 beneficiaries of these technical adjustments are all in New York, and 8 of those 10 are represented by Democrats who just happen to be strong Jeffries allies. She pulled out a chart and held it up for the cameras. It showed a clear pattern: districts represented by Jeffries' political supporters. The chart Nancy Mace held up was devastating in its simplicity. Color-coded bars showed funding allocations under the original agreed formula in blue and the revised formula in red. For Jeffries' allies, the red bars extended far beyond the blue ones. For everyone else, especially Republican districts, the red bars were noticeably shorter. The visual evidence was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or technical adjustment. Hakeem Jeffries' legendary composure was beginning to crack. His communications director, seated in the front row behind him, was typing furiously on her phone, likely alerting the broader leadership team that they had a crisis. Several Democratic committee members who had applauded Jeffries' opening statement now looked uncomfortable, caught between party loyalty and the damning evidence being presented. Representative Mace, the committee chairman, interjected, "These are serious allegations. Are you saying that Leader Jeffries deliberately manipulated the funding formula for political benefit?" "I'm not alleging anything, Mr. Chairman." Mace replied evenly. "I'm presenting facts. The facts are these: we had an agreed bipartisan bill. That bill was changed without my knowledge or consent. Those changes disproportionately benefit Leader Jeffries' district and his political allies. And those changes were made by Leader Jeffries himself, as evidenced by the metadata in the legislative drafting system." She pulled out another document. This is a screenshot from the House Legislative Council's tracking system. It shows who made edits to the bill and when. On April 17 at 11:47 p.m., someone using Leader Jeffries' congressional login credentials made 43 edits to the funding formula sections. Those edits are the ones we're discussing today. The specificity was damning. This wasn't speculation or partisan accusation, this was documented evidence with timestamps and user IDs directly linking Jeffries to the unauthorized changes. Jeffries finally found his voice, though it lacked his earlier confidence. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond to these accusations." "Please proceed, Leader Jeffries," the chairman said, though his tone had shifted from congratulatory to cautious. Jeffries straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that his staff would later recognize as a tell that he was rattled. "First, let me be clear that any changes made to this legislation were done in consultation with committee staff and technical experts. The original formula, while well-intentioned, had some methodological issues that needed to be addressed." "What methodological issues?" Mace asked immediately. "The formula didn't adequately account for the higher costs of construction in urban areas," Jeffries explained, gaining some momentum. "It didn't reflect the reality that infrastructure projects in dense cities cost more per capita than projects in rural areas. The adjustments I made, and yes, I made them, were designed to ensure fair distribution based on actual project costs, not just raw population numbers." It was a reasonable-sounding explanation, the kind of technical justification that might have worked if delivered to a friendly audience or in a less scrutinized setting. But Nancy Mace had clearly prepared for exactly this response. "That's interesting," Mace said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Because the Congressional Budget Office analyzed both versions of our bill. I have their analysis right here." The CBO found that the urban cost adjustments you claim to be making don't actually align with real-world construction cost data. In fact, your formula would send disproportionate funding to urban districts even in cases where construction costs are average or below average. She held up the CBO report, its official seal visible to the cameras. The CBO's exact words are, "The revised formula appears to prioritize political geography over economic need or cost considerations." That's the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office saying your changes don't match your stated justification. Several Republican committee members were now leaning forward with visible interest. Even some Democrats looked troubled. The CBO was considered the gold standard for objective analysis. Its credibility was hard to dispute. Furthermore, Mace continued, if your concern was truly about urban construction costs, why didn't you discuss it with me during our 6 months of negotiations? We had regular meetings, extensive staff discussions, and multiple opportunities to address any methodological concerns. Yet you never once mentioned this issue until after you'd already made the changes secretly. Jeffries shifted uncomfortably. Representative, the final drafting process involves technical refinements that don't always require renegotiating the entire framework. That's standard legislative practice. Standard practice is to inform your bipartisan partner. Mace shot back, her voice rising slightly for the first time. Standard practice is to say, hey Nancy, I think we need to adjust the urban cost factors. Standard practice is not to make changes in the middle of the night and hope nobody notices. The personal betrayal was evident in her tone. This wasn't just about policy disagreements or political maneuvering. Mace had invested months of trust in Jeffries, had defended their partnership to skeptical colleagues, and had genuinely believed they were building something meaningful. The realization that she had been played was clearly painful and infuriating in equal measure. Let me ask you a direct question, Leader Jeffries. Mace said, locking eyes with him across the hearing room. When you gave your opening statement today, talking about putting country over party and no political favoritism, did you know that the bill you were describing no longer existed, that you had fundamentally changed it to benefit yourself and your allies? The question hung in the air, its moral weight undeniable. Jeffries had delivered an eloquent speech about bipartisan cooperation while knowing he had secretly undermined that very cooperation. The hypocrisy was stark. Jeffries took a long drink of water, clearly buying time to formulate a response. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more defensive. I believed then, and I believe now, that the adjustments I made improved the bill. I regret not communicating those changes more clearly to Representative Mace, but my intent was always to make the legislation more effective. Your intent was to funnel an extra $85 million to your own district. Mace countered. Let's at least be honest about that. A Democratic committee member, a progressive from California who had been watching the exchange with growing concern, raised her hand. Mr. Chairman, I think we need to understand the full scope of how these formula changes affect all districts. Can Representative Mace provide a complete breakdown? Absolutely, Mace replied, clearly having anticipated this request. She nodded to her staff, who began distributing a thick packet to all committee members. This analysis shows funding allocation by district under both the original and revised formulas. You'll notice some interesting patterns. As members began flipping through the packets, reactions varied. Republicans looked vindicated, their earlier skepticism about bipartisan cooperation seemingly justified. Some Democrats looked angry at Jeffries for creating this political disaster. Others looked troubled as they found their own districts in the analysis, discovering they were among the losers in Jeffries's revised formula. Let me highlight some specific examples, Mace said, returning to her prepared materials. Representative Johnson from Georgia, a Democrat, I might add, would see her district's allocation drop from $53 million to $28 million under Leader Jeffries's changes. Representative Williams from Texas, also a Democrat, would go from $47 million to $19 million. In fact, of the 68 Democrats whose districts would receive less funding under the revised formula, 61 of them are not part of Leader Jeffries's inner circle. The implication was clear. Jeffries hadn't just directed money away from Republicans, he had effectively taxed his own Democratic colleagues to benefit himself and his most loyal supporters. It was a betrayal not just of bipartisanship, but of his own caucus. Representative Johnson, whose district losses Mace had just highlighted, spoke up. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. Leader Jeffries, did you consult with any Democratic members outside New York about these formula changes? Jeffries hesitated. The changes were technical in nature. I didn't believe broad consultation was necessary for. That's a no, Johnson interrupted, her frustration evident. You unilaterally changed a bipartisan bill to benefit your district and your allies, and you didn't bother to tell anyone, including members of your own party whose districts would be hurt by your changes. The coalition that had supported Jeffries' leadership was beginning to show cracks. When a member challenges their own party leader publicly in a hearing, it signals serious discontent. Johnson's willingness to confront Jeffries demonstrated that the damage wasn't just to his bipartisan image, but to his position within his own caucus. Nancy Mace seized the moment. This is why I wanted to bring this to the committee's attention. This isn't about Democrat versus Republican, this is about trust. When we negotiate bipartisan legislation, there has to be a basic level of honesty and good faith. Without that, the entire process collapses. She turned directly to Jeffries. Leader Jeffries, you and I spent hours together working on this bill. We had dinners where we talked about our visions for infrastructure, our hopes for bipartisan cooperation, our belief that we could show Washington a better way. I trusted you. I defended you to my Republican colleagues who said you would inevitably betray me, and I was wrong to trust you. The personal nature of the statement made the room uncomfortable. This wasn't political theater or tactical maneuvering, this was genuine hurt and anger from someone who felt personally betrayed. Jeffries attempted a response. Representative Mace, I understand you're upset, but I think you're overreacting to what we're meant to be, overreacting. Mace's voice cut through his attempted explanation. You secretly changed our agreement to enrich your district by $85 million, and you think I'm overreacting. She pulled out yet another document from her seemingly endless folder. Let me show you something else interesting. This is a list of campaign contributions to your leadership PAC over the past 6 months. Do you notice anything interesting about the timing? Mace held up a chart showing contribution patterns. In the 2 weeks after you made your secret changes to our bill, you received over $400,000 in contributions from real estate developers, construction companies, and labor unions based in Brooklyn. All entities that would directly benefit from the increased infrastructure spending in your district. Do you think that's a coincidence? The implication was explosive. If Jeffries had changed the bill to benefit specific economic interests in his district, and those interests then contributed to his political operation, it suggested a quid pro quo arrangement that could potentially violate ethics rules or even federal law. Those contributions are completely legal and reported according to all FEC requirements. Jeffries responded quickly, his legal training evident in the defensive posture. And I resent the suggestion that they're connected to legislative decisions. I'm sure they're legal, Mace acknowledged. But they certainly raise questions about your motivations for changing our bill. Were you trying to improve the legislation, as you claim? Or were you trying to deliver benefits to your political supporters and your district in ways that would generate financial support for your continued leadership? The hearing room had transformed from a celebration of bipartisan cooperation into something far more serious, a public unraveling of trust that went to the heart of how Congress functioned. The cameras captured every moment as Hakeem Jeffries, one of the Democratic Party's most prominent leaders, sat visibly struggling to contain a scandal that threatened not just the infrastructure bill but his entire political future. Nancy Mace wasn't finished. She had clearly prepared for this confrontation with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case, and each document she revealed seemed more damaging than the last. The manila folder that had started the hearing closed was now spread across her table, papers organized in careful stacks that suggested hours of preparation. Chairman, Mace said, addressing the committee but keeping her eyes on Jeffries. I want to make sure everyone understands the full scope of what happened here. This wasn't a minor technical adjustment or a good faith disagreement about methodology. This was a systematic effort to transform a bipartisan bill into a vehicle for political patronage. She pulled out another analysis, this one appearing to be a detailed breakdown of specific projects. Let me walk you through some of the actual projects that would be funded under Leader Jeffries' revised formula. In Brooklyn's downtown development zone, $67 million would go to renovate transit infrastructure around the Barclays Center. That's a privately owned arena that generates enormous revenue. Why should federal taxpayers fund infrastructure improvements that primarily benefit a private entertainment venue? Jeffries attempted to interrupt. That project would benefit the entire community by improving access to the entire community. Mace's voice carried a sharp edge. Or the real estate developers who own property around the arena and who coincidentally have donated heavily to your campaigns. Because according to property records, 3 of your top 10 donors own commercial real estate within 2 blocks of that proposed project. The infrastructure improvements you're funding with federal dollars would directly increase the value of their properties. The connection between political contributions and project selection was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about changing a formula, it was about directing public money to benefit private interests that supported Jeffries politically and financially. A Republican committee member from Texas who had been quietly observing until now spoke up. Representative Mace, are you saying that Leader Jeffries essentially sold infrastructure funding to his donors? I'm saying the evidence suggests a pattern, Mace replied carefully. Donors contribute to his campaign. He changes our bill to direct federal funds to projects that benefit those same donors. Those donors then contribute more money. It's a cycle that turns public infrastructure funding into a political machine. The chairman, clearly troubled by the direction of the hearing, intervened. Leader Jeffries, these are extraordinarily serious allegations. Do you want to provide a comprehensive response? Jeffries conferred briefly with his attorney before responding. His usual eloquence had given way to a more defensive posture. Mr. Chairman, I categorically deny any suggestion of corruption or quid pro quo arrangements. The projects included in the revised bill are legitimate infrastructure needs. The fact that some donors may benefit is incidental to the public purpose these projects serve. Incidental? Mace's tone made clear she found that explanation inadequate. Let me share one more piece of evidence that might help the committee evaluate that claim. She held up what appeared to be email printouts. These are communications between Leader Jeffries' staff and lobbyists representing the Brooklyn Real Estate Association. The emails date from early April, right around the time Leader Jeffries was making his technical adjustments to our bill. In one email, a lobbyist writes, confirming our discussion about the transit corridor project. Our members are prepared to show their appreciation through the usual channels if this moves forward. That's dated April 10th, 1 week before Leader Jeffries changed our bill. The implication was devastating. The emails suggested that Jeffries or his staff had been coordinating with interest groups about changing the bill in exchange for political support. Even if technically legal, it represented exactly the kind of transactional politics that the bipartisan bill was supposed to transcend. Jeffries' face had gone from controlled to visibly angry. Those emails are taken completely out of context. My staff regularly communicates with stakeholders about legislative proposals. That's not corruption, it's constituent service. Constituent service. Mace's voice rose with genuine indignation. Leader Jeffries, your constituents are the people of Brooklyn who need better schools, safer streets, and genuine infrastructure improvements. Your constituents are not real estate developers and construction company executives who donate to your campaigns. And our bill was supposed to serve all Americans, not just your political network. The moral clarity of her argument was cutting through Jeffries' legalistic defenses. Whatever the technical legality of his actions, the ethical breach was clear. He had taken a bipartisan effort meant to serve the public interest and transformed it into a vehicle for political and personal benefit. Several committee members were now calling for investigations. A Democrat from Michigan proposed referring the matter to the Ethics Committee. A Republican from Florida suggested the FBI should examine whether any federal corruption statutes had been violated. The hearing that was supposed to celebrate bipartisan cooperation had become a launching pad for multiple investigations into Jeffries' conduct. Nancy Mace held up her hand for quiet. Mr. Chairman, I have one final point to make before we close this discussion. Throughout this process, Leader Jeffries has talked eloquently about the importance of trust, cooperation, and putting country over party. Those are beautiful words. But they're meaningless if they're not backed by action. She gathered the papers spread across her table, organizing them back into the manila folder with deliberate care. I came to Congress believing that bipartisan cooperation was possible if both sides acted in good faith. Leader Jeffries has taught me a painful lesson. good faith cannot be assumed. It must be verified. Trust must be earned through consistent action, not claimed through eloquent speeches. Turning directly to Jeffries, she delivered her final statement. Leader Jeffries, I will not support the version of this bill that you secretly amended. I will be introducing the original bipartisan version as a standalone bill. Any member who believes in genuine bipartisan cooperation, who believes that infrastructure funding should be based on need rather than political connections, is welcome to co-sponsor it. But I will never again work with you on legislation because you've proven that your word means nothing. The personal nature of the rejection was striking. Mace wasn't just opposing the bill, she was publicly ending any future collaboration with one of Congress's most powerful leaders. It was a remarkable moment of political courage, choosing principle over the pragmatic benefits that could come from maintaining a relationship with the Democratic leader. Jeffries sat silently, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His communications team in the gallery looked stricken. Democratic leadership staff were already on their phones, likely doing damage control with nervous members who were wondering if their leader had just become a political liability. The hearing concluded shortly thereafter, but the real impact was just beginning. Within minutes, Jeffries' betrayal was trending nationally on social media. Clips of Mace's methodical presentation and Jeffries' defensive responses went viral across every platform. Political commentators struggled to remember a more complete public dismantling of a party leader by a member of the opposing party. The immediate fallout was explosive. Progressive Democrats, many of whom had supported Jeffries' leadership reluctantly, saw the scandal as confirmation of their suspicions about his moderate transactional approach to politics. They began calling for new leadership elections. Moderate Democrats, who had been Jeffries' core base of support, felt betrayed that his actions had undermined the bipartisan cooperation they believed was essential to governing effectively. Republican leaders initially celebrated Mace's exposure of Jeffries' duplicity, but some strategists worried about the broader implications. If bipartisan deals could be secretly sabotaged by either side, how could any cross-party cooperation ever succeed? The Jeffries scandal threatened to make the already difficult process of bipartisan legislation essentially impossible. Nancy Mace became an overnight political celebrity. Her methodical presentation, her obvious preparation, and her willingness to publicly break with a powerful figure earned praise across the political spectrum. Conservative outlets celebrated her as a truth teller who had exposed Democratic corruption. Some progressive outlets, despite partisan differences, praised her for holding power accountable regardless of political convenience. She gave a single interview that evening, appearing on CNN with Jake Tapper. Her demeanor was professional but clearly still angry about the betrayal. Representative Mace, do you regret trying to work with Leader Jeffries? Tapper asked. I regret that he betrayed our agreement, Mace replied carefully. But I don't regret trying. Bipartisan cooperation is essential for solving America's problems. The fact that Leader Jeffries abused that process doesn't mean we should abandon the effort. It means we need to be more vigilant about ensuring both sides are negotiating honestly. What would you say to Leader Jeffries if he were here? Tapper pressed. Mace paused, seeming to consider the question carefully. I would say that leadership is about more than power and position. It's about character. You had an opportunity to show that Democrats and Republicans could work together, that we could put the country's interests ahead of partisan advantage. Instead, you chose to pursue narrow political benefits for yourself and your allies. That's not leadership. That's exactly what's wrong with Washington. The interview clip was shared millions of times, with many viewers noting Mace's composure and moral clarity. She had transformed from a relatively unknown congresswoman into a national figure who had stood up to power and won. For Hakeem Jeffries, the consequences were immediate and severe. Within a week, 3 Democratic representatives had called for his resignation as Democratic leader. The Congressional Black Caucus, which had been one of his strongest bases of support, issued a statement expressing deep concern about the allegations and calling for a full investigation. The House Ethics Committee announced it would examine whether Jeffries had violated congressional rules regarding conflicts of interest. Most damaging was the fracturing of trust within his own caucus. Democratic members who had supported Jeffries' leadership began privately expressing doubts about whether he could continue to be effective. Several told reporters on Background that they felt betrayed not just by his actions but by his attempt to deceive his colleagues about what he had done. The New York delegation, which had been Jeffries' core political base, found itself in a difficult position. While they benefited from the funding redirections Jeffries had made, being associated with what increasingly looked like corruption threatened their own reputations. Several New York Democrats issued carefully worded statements supporting infrastructure investment while avoiding any mention of Jeffries or his role in the scandal. 2 weeks after the hearing, Nancy Mace introduced her revised infrastructure bill, the original bipartisan version she and Jeffries had agreed to before his secret amendments. She titled it the Honest Infrastructure Investment Act, a not-so-subtle dig at Jeffries' dishonesty. The bill attracted over 100 co-sponsors from both parties, including a dozen Democrats willing to publicly break with their leader. The political symbolism was powerful. A Republican freshman had managed to build broader bipartisan support than the Democratic leader. It was a stunning reversal that illustrated just how badly Jeffries had damaged his credibility. Jeffries attempted damage control through a series of media appearances, but his explanations sounded increasingly defensive. He claimed the formula changes were minor, that Mace was overreacting, that his motives had been misunderstood, but each interview seemed to generate new questions rather than providing satisfactory answers. When pressed about the emails connecting his bill changes to donor contributions, he became testy and evasive, further undermining his credibility. 3 months after the hearing, The Washington Post published a comprehensive investigative piece titled The Jeffries Method: How the Democratic Leader Turned Bipartisan Legislation into Political Patronage. The article, based on extensive document review and interviews with dozens of current and former staffers, painted a picture of a leader who routinely manipulated legislative processes for political benefit, who maintained power through a combination of promised benefits and threatened retribution, and who had created a political machine that prioritized loyalty over competence or integrity. The Post investigation revealed that the infrastructure bill wasn't an isolated incident. Jeffries had used similar tactics on other legislation, quietly amending bills to benefit allies and punish those who weren't sufficiently loyal. The pattern suggested not a one-time ethical lapse but a systematic approach to leadership that treated legislation as currency to be distributed to supporters. 6 months after the hearing, Hakeem Jeffries announced he would not seek re-election as Democratic leader. In a letter to colleagues, he claimed he wanted to spend more time on policy work and less time on the administrative burdens of leadership. But everyone understood the real reason he had lost the confidence of his caucus and faced almost certain defeat if he ran for another term. The leadership election that followed was contentious, with multiple candidates arguing about the direction of the party and the importance of ethical leadership. The ultimate winner made bipartisan cooperation and ethical governance central themes of her campaign, explicitly promising to never repeat the kind of behavior that had ended Jeffries' leadership tenure. Nancy Mace's political trajectory, meanwhile, continued upward. She became one of the most sought-after voices in Republican politics, frequently appearing on news programs and speaking at events around the country. Her ability to build bipartisan coalitions while maintaining her principles made her unusual in contemporary politics. Speculation began building about higher office, senator, governor, or even national tickets. But Mace remained focused on her work in Congress. She continued to seek bipartisan partnerships, though always with more rigorous verification processes. She implemented what her staff called trust but verify protocols for any cross-party negotiations, requiring documentation of all agreements and regular reviews to ensure no secret changes were made. The Mace-Jeffries confrontation entered political lore as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust in politics and the consequences of betraying that trust. Political science professors used video of the hearing to teach students about ethics, accountability, and the importance of transparency in legislative processes. The phrase "pulling a Jeffries" entered political vocabulary, meaning to secretly undermine a bipartisan agreement for personal or partisan benefit. 2 years after the hearing, Nancy Mace was invited to speak at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government about bipartisan cooperation. In her address, she reflected on the experience with Jeffries and what it had taught her about politics and governance. Trust is the foundation of everything we do in a democracy, Mace told the assembled students and faculty. Without trust, we can't negotiate in good faith. We can't compromise. we can't govern effectively. What Hakeem Jeffries did wasn't just betray me personally, he betrayed the very possibility of bipartisan cooperation. But she didn't end on a pessimistic note. The encouraging thing is that most members of Congress in both parties genuinely want to do the right thing. They want to solve problems and serve their constituents. The Jeffries incident was painful, but it was also clarifying. It showed us what happens when leadership fails, when personal ambition trumps public service, and it showed us the importance of accountability. She paused, looking out at the audience. I'm often asked if I regret trying to work with Jeffries, if the betrayal has made me cynical about bipartisan cooperation, and my answer is always the same. I regret that he chose to betray our agreement, but I'll never regret trying. Because the alternative, giving up on cooperation entirely, means accepting permanent dysfunction, and I'm not willing to accept that. The speech received a standing ovation and was later published in multiple political journals as a statement on the importance of ethical leadership and institutional trust. The infrastructure bill that Mace eventually passed, the honest version without Jeffries' amendments, became law 8 months after the hearing. It was signed by the president in a bipartisan ceremony that Mace attended but Jeffries notably did not. The bill directed $8.4 billion to infrastructure projects across the country, using the objective need-based formula that Mace and Jeffries had originally agreed upon. When reporters asked Mace how it felt to see the bill become law, she gave a bittersweet smile. It feels like success mixed with regret. We could have passed this a year ago if Jeffries had been honest. We could have shown that bipartisanship works. Instead, we had to go through a painful public battle that damaged trust and made future cooperation harder. But at least the right version of the bill is now law. At least we got there eventually. The marble halls of Congress had witnessed many political dramas over the centuries, but few as impactful as the day Nancy Mace opened a manila folder and systematically exposed how the Democratic leader had betrayed bipartisan cooperation for personal and political gain. It served as a powerful reminder that in politics, as in life, trust is earned slowly but can be destroyed in an instant. And once destroyed, it requires extraordinary effort to rebuild. For Hakeem Jeffries, his political career never fully recovered. He remained in Congress, but as a diminished figure, his once bright prospects for national leadership permanently dimmed by the scandal. For Nancy Mace, the confrontation established her as a politician willing to prioritize principle over convenience, even when it meant publicly breaking with powerful figures. And for the institution of Congress, the episode became a case study in why ethical leadership and transparent processes matter, because without them, even the most promising bipartisan efforts can collapse into recrimination and distrust. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth political analysis. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the moments when courage confronts corruption and truth defeats deception.